Syrians take to the streets in massive demonstrations that demand freedom and the overthrow of al-Assad regime. A new massacre in Al-Mayadeen raises the death toll to 180, mostly in Damascus, and the military campaigns continue. The UNHCR announces today that more than 200,000 Syrians have fled to neighboring countries. Welcome to Orient TV English News Bulletin. At least 180 victims fell in Syria today, according to the Syrian Human Rights Network. 44 of them died in a massacre that took place in Deir ez-Zor after al-Assad regime forces bombed an entire building by fighter jets. Meanwhile, the Free Army battalions were able to control Al-Hajjana barrier, and they expelled al-Assad forces from it after fierce battles, while the town of Al-Quriya witnessed a wide displacement movement of citizens from the neighboring towns amid fear of the regime's military operations.
The regime's massacres are still shifting from town to another in Syria. Dozens were killed and injured due to the regime's bombing that was launched by MiG planes and targeted the city of Al-Mayadeen and Deir ez-Zor, which caused the destruction of many residential buildings. This massacre comes after the Free Syrian Army took control over the security barrier of Al-Hajjana in the city after clashes that lasted for days. The towns and villages of Deir ez-Zor are still undergoing constant bombing campaigns that left dozens injured and killed. Al-Kharita, Al-Quriya, Al-Hamidiyya and many other neighborhoods are still being bombed, which led citizens in many towns of Al-Qura to run away. The scenes of home destruction consumed the towns such as the city's mosques that have become a new target for the regime's bombings. The situation of Deir ez-Zor citizens that are becoming more drastic every day did not stop them from managing their basic life needs in the most modest ways despite the hardships they face. This comes in addition to their resilience to continue the revolution despite the besiegement and constant bombings that are launched by the regime's planes and artillery.
In Damascus and its countryside, at least 55 victims fell today as the regime forces continue their military campaigns on the city of Daraya, where the number of its victims raised to 74 in 2 days, in addition to more than 300 wounded amid a difficult humanitarian and medical situation. Also, victims fell in the town of Utwaya and Isbeni, in addition to the city of Douma, where the regime forces opened fire on the people to prevent them from reaching the mosques. Also, the cities of Al-Zabadani, Saqba, Zamalka and Al-Tal were targeted by the regime's helicopters. Also in Damascus, the episodic square witnessed clashes between the regime's army and the Free Syrian Army as mortar shelling renewed on the neighborhoods of Nahar Aishi, Al-Qadam and Al-Assali, where several victims fell dead and wounded. The shelling also targeted the neighborhoods of Al-Hajar, Al-Aswad and Al-Qazzaz, and clashes took place in a 13th Street in the center of the capital, next to the military barracks. And on the other hand, the citizens of Bab Sreji took to the streets in demonstrations calling slogans against the regime. Several demonstrations also went out today in Damascus, specifically in Al-Zahra neighborhood, demanding the overthrow of al-Assad's regime. Also, several protests took to the streets in Damascus suburbs, such as in Douma and Yabrud, supporting the affected cities and condemning the massacres committed by al-Assad regime forces. Al-Mu'addamiyya, Daraya and Artus bordering Damascus and from the south and from the west are all being exposed to a military operation while Assad regime forces commit repetitive massacres of public executions and random shelling. More concerning this we follow in the following report.
Massacres in the capital and its suburbs see no end. Mu'addamiyya, Daraya and Artus each witnessed their fair share of massacres where collectively around 100 civilians were unjustly murdered, most of which were publicly executed. The families of Mu'addamiyya lost their land to the Assad regime forces' campaigns of repression without having anyone fight for their property, as the violence of the regime forces' brutal military campaigns drives them out, just like the residents of Douma in the capital. The Assad regime uses the siege on the afflicted areas on the outskirts of Damascus to increase the number of murdered victims in the city of Daraya alone, with only 36 hours to no less than 56 murdered victims in addition to 300 wounded civilians, with numbers only increasing during the difficult humanitarian conditions that the people in the area live through. Distress calls continue to reach all kinds of international, human, civil, or governmental organizations to urgently intervene and put an end to the Assad regime's genocide campaign in Syria by all means possible. However, mothers of the murdered victims still ask, will anyone answer their calls?
And to know more about the updates in Damascus and its suburbs, with us on the phone, Alexia, an activist from Damascus. Alexia, good evening and welcome into our bulletin. I want to know from you the updates in the capital, Damascus, and its suburbs, and especially today that the number of victims in the capital is the highest among other provinces.
Yes, it has been noticed that the death toll is rising in the capital and the suburbs. 50 casualties were documented so far, women and children among them. This is due to the intense shelling that has been going on all day. Many neighborhoods in Damascus are under fire. Al-Sali, Al-Qadam, Al-Hajar Al-Aswad, Barze took the most hits. Shelling on these neighbors was intense this morning and now again, as we speak. These neighborhoods have been bombarded by artillery, tanks, and even missiles from helicopters.
Yes.
We could hear, all of Damascus could hear the explosions all around. And several residents were on fire, as well as many families have fled their homes in fear of their lives. Some of them just fled out of shelling, and some of them have fled in fear of their lives from Assad security forces, Shabbiha, from committing new massacres like what happened this morning in Nahr Aishi. 7 men were found today executed in the fresh massacre. Their bodies, they were found mutilated brutally, and some were even beyond recognition.
Alexia, there were demonstrations that went out today, especially in the suburbs. Were these demonstrations protected or surrounded by members of the Free Syrian Army, or is there any presence of the Free Syrian Army in the capital or in the suburbs?
There was a presence of the Free Syrian armies in the suburbs protecting some of these demonstrations. Like in Douma, it was a huge demonstration in Douma. More than 10,000 people took to the main square next to the Grand Mosque. But sadly, shortly afterwards, the shelling started on the city again, leaving more than 17 casualties up till now. And I think that this number is really likely to rise. These demonstrations still are peaceful and really courageous in the light of all of this shelling and all of this brutality by the Assad forces and the Shabbiha death squad. But it's also all around in the suburbs where they took to the streets by the shelling. The casualties are still rising, like in Zamalka and in Daraya. It's really catastrophic, the situation in Daraya is.
Yes, thank you very much, Alexia, an activist from Damascus, for being with us. Al-Assad regime forces committed another massacre today in the town of Kansafra in Al-Zawiya mountain in Idlib, where at least 33 victims were killed, including women and children, after residential neighborhoods were targeted by military fighter jets. Meanwhile, the villages of Al-Zawiya mountain are witnessing heavy shelling that targeted Kafr Awayid, Joseph and Basamis. The bombardment also targeted this morning the city of Ma'arid Masrin, which led to plumes of black smokes rising from residential buildings, and the number of victims who fell dead and injured in Ma'arat al-Nu'man due to similar bombing. Staying in Idlib, where anti-government demonstrations took to the streets today, calling for freedom and the overthrow of al-Assad regime. And the protesters from the town of Tamania and Al-Habit, and also the city of Saraqib, took to the streets in support of the devastated cities. And despite the military operations, thousands took to the streets in Binish and Sirmin in the countryside of Idlib and condemned the regime's brutality. Al-Assad regime forces commit new massacres in Idlib. This comes as they intensify their military campaigns on the province. More about Idlib we see in the following report.
Death is still knocking on the doors of the Syrian people, and this time in the village of Kansafra, that witnessed fierce bombardment by the Russian-made MiG planes, which resulted in killing and injuring many citizens, mostly women and children, as many houses were also destroyed. Mortar shells are still pouring on the villages of Jabal al-Zawiya from the security barriers that are positioned in the village of Mhabbel, which targeted Bsamis, Marata, Al-Barra, and Firkiya, which led to killing many civilians. The same scene was also repeated in Khan Sheikhoun, Kili, Kafr Nabal, Adana and Al-Habit.
قصف من قبل الطيران الحربي على منطقة بسنقول في تاريخ 24/8/2012.
The MiG military planes bombed the town of Ma'arat Masrin and Hazano in the northern suburbs, the matter which led to killing dozens of civilians and injuring others. The same situation also occurred in Ma'arat al-Nu'man, where the regime destroys Al-Rawda Mosque. The military campaigns also reached the villages of Al-Janudiyya, Al-Qastan, and Al-Qayqun that are part of al-Shughur, amid a campaign of raids and arbitrary arrests.
قصف على أريحة مدينة أريحة الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر.
The troubled city of Jericho is also witnessing fierce bombardment and the spreading of snipers on rooftops that target everything that moves. This comes amid a massive shortage of medical supplies and makes it hard to receive any help due to the suffocating besiegement.
And coming up later in the bulletin, sniper bullets killed 3 people in Lebanon despite the ceasefire agreement. Welcome back. You're watching Orient TV English News Bulletin. Bombing continued on the neighborhoods of Aleppo and many areas in the suburbs, where dozens were injured after the regime's artillery and helicopter shelling. The bombing also reached the neighborhoods of Al-Maysar and Saif al-Dawla. Meanwhile, the neighborhoods of Al-Qura al-Ardiyya witnessed heavy clashes between the Free Syrian Army and the regime's forces. Moreover, in Aleppo suburbs, the regime bombed the towns and the villages of Darat Azzeh, Al-Abzimul, Atarib, and Andan.
حريق في أحد الأبنية بسبب القصف على الحي. الله أكبر.
This is footage from a video report by the Amnesty International Human Rights Organization, and this is Donatella Rovera, who visited Aleppo on behalf of the organization and summarized that the Syrian civilians are facing terrible violence, where she accuses the Assad regime of targeting residential districts with the indiscriminate shelling and airstrikes.
In the Bustan al-Qasra area, a man came running holding a wounded child who had been hit by...
Yes, the situation of Bustan al-Qasra district surprised her, as she reported witnessing the regime forces using inaccurate weaponry such as unguided bombs, artillery shells and mortar, which only increase the level of danger the civilians are exposed to. 30 military operations killed and injured a large number of civilians, including many groups of children who of course were not involved in the military battle against the regime forces.
This particular crater was in a district called Bustan al-Qasr, where a similar bomb killed a family of 7. In the Fardouz district, members of the Suri family, a little boy, 3-year-old, he was killed when an artillery shell hit the house.
Furthermore, constant bombardments terrorized the districts of Salah ad-Din, Saif al-Dawla, Al-Idha'a, Bustan al-Qasr and Al-Firdaus, and activists affirmed that the Free Syrian Army inflicted vital losses in the Assad regime's army, where they secured control over Al-Arqub district and dropped one of the regime's military helicopters. 37 blood-covered days and the battle in Aleppo remains in action, where the Free Syrian Army secured about 70% of Aleppo's neighborhoods, while the Assad regime answers with indiscriminate dreadful shelling and the disconnection of all communications.
Activists stated that more than 20 citizens were killed, including 4 children, in addition to dozens of injured due to the bombardment that targeted the town of Da'al in Dir'a. Moreover, the Syrian Center for Documentation reported finding 6 bodies, 4 citizens who were stabbed and killed by knives in Al-Hirak. To that, the towns of Nasib, Khail and Atiba were bombed by rocket launchers and machine guns and the flying of spy planes all over the towns. Meanwhile, demonstrations continue in Dir'a this Friday in several cities and villages, including the village of Adwan in Dir'a suburbs and the village of Al-Mata'iyya, where protesters took to the streets in anti-government demonstrations. Also, protesters took to the streets in Khirbat Ghazali and Ibta, supporting the devastated cities and demanding the overthrow of Al-Assad's regime. Staying in Dir'a, where the Al-Assad regime forces continued bombing the city of Al-Hirak in Dir'a suburbs. More about Dir'a's updates we follow in the following report.
داعل 24/8/2012 جراء القصف الوحشي من الطائرات الأسدية على مدينة داعل.
Don't be sad in Dir'a. God is with us. This is the name of this week's Special Friday, as protesters are supporting the troubled cities, especially Huran and Da'al, that witnessed heavy bombing that even hit nurses and doctors, in addition to women and children. Injuries that were inflicted on the elderly, and the citizens run away from the bombardment and destruction in the city of Al-Hirak. And what also happens there goes as the following. Horrific massacres are being committed against the citizens of Al-Hirak, along with the public executions, injured civilians that die while they're still alive amid a complete absence of medical supplies. Even medicines can't find its way to treat the injured due to the constant mortar shelling that was launched by the regime forces. The bombing also reached the towns of Asura and Eastern Mleha that welcomed displaced citizens. Meanwhile, the regime forces bombed the cities of Busr al-Harir, Da'al, Al-Karak and many others, using helicopters and mortar shells. This comes at a time where the area of Al-Laja witnessed heavy bombing from the 12th Battalion that surrounded the cities. Don't be sad in Dir'a. God is with us. This is the theme that the Syrians decided to take this Friday for the revolution, after the country witnessed the most violent war and displacement of its citizens in the country's history.
In Homs, many citizens were killed and dozens were injured in the city of Al-Rastan. Activists also confirmed that the regime's planes are throwing explosives on Al-Rastan, which led to destroying many neighborhoods, while the town of Al-Ghanto witnessed a similar bombardment which shook the village amid a complete disconnection of electricity. Furthermore, in the city of Homs, the regime's shells targeted the neighborhood of Al-Khalidiyya, where heavy gunfire was also heard. And coming up in the bulletin, sniper bullets killed 3 people in Lebanon despite the ceasefire agreement. Hama witnessed intense clashes between Al-Assad regime forces and the Free Syrian Army in the districts of Al-Qusur, during which shelling was renewed in the direction of Al-Arba'in district. Also, Al-Assad regime forces executed a military operation of raids in the area of Al-Sabuniya and the park of Ibn Rushd. Meanwhile, the regime's artillery shelling was also heard in the city of Karnaz, while demonstrations filled the Hama-Aleppo highway, condemning the regime's massacres. In Latakia's suburbs, the Shabiha forces of the regime set the forests of Al-Hifi on fire, where also a big part of farms were completely burned, while the villages of Babinna and Al-Jankil also witnessed heavy artillery bombardment. Moreover, the security and the Shabiha forces carried out raid and arbitrary arrests in the neighborhood of Al-Rambi Shamali, where many stores were broken into and looted.
السحب الدخانية تغطي سماء جبل التركمان.
The United Nations High Commissioner of Refugees announced today that more than 200,000 Syrians have fled to neighboring countries, a figure that exceeded the expectations set by the Commission until the end of the year. Adrian Edwards, the UNHCR spokesman, said this number reflects an increase of about 30,000 refugees during the last week alone to Turkey, Lebanon, Iraq and Jordan. He pointed out that the deterioration of the security situation in Lebanon led to the stop of their efforts to help refugees fleeing the conflict in Syria despite the ongoing operations.
Security in Lebanon this week has been a concern to us. We opened interim.
In Lebanon, clashes erupted at dawn today between the people of Jabal al-Tibbani, Jabal Muhsin and Bab al-Tibbani in the Lebanese city of Tripoli. The clashes came after a warning of calmness was present in the city yesterday, despite some sniping operations, where the Lebanese Prime Minister Najib Mikati headed the security meeting, which included several ministers, along with the Tripoli city deputies and the number of security officials regarding the deployment of military forces between the two sides. Meanwhile, Mohammed Hassan Al-Amin and Hani Fahas, they called for the Shiite community to support the Syrian revolution after the meeting with the UN international observers. Politically, the German Chancellor Angela Merkel and the French President François Hollande called during their meeting in Berlin to move in order to press resolutions on the Security Council on Syria, particularly on the humanitarian situation. Merkel said that her country will push for the passage of the necessary decisions in the UN Security Council and for international decisions to make progress, particularly with regard to the humanitarian situation in Syria. And for his part, Holland said that Paris plans to move with the European Union and with those who believe that Bashar al-Assad cannot remain in power because he put the lives of his people at risk. The meeting of the Turkish-U.S. Working Group on Syria was concluded with an agreement to develop a coordination mechanism between the two countries to follow up the developments on the Turkish-Syrian border. Meanwhile, the security officials from the United States and Turkey began yesterday their first meeting in order to accelerate the fall of the Syrian regime, and the two sides discussed contingency plans that can be applied in case Syria used chemical weapons, emphasizing on preventing groups such as the PKK and Al-Qaeda to exploit the situation in the northern Syria. And before we wrap up, here's another look at today's top stories. Syrians take to the streets in massive demonstrations that demand freedom and the overthrow of al-Assad's regime. A new massacre in Al-Mayadin raises the death toll to 180, mostly in Damascus, and military campaigns continue. The UNHCR announces today that more than 200,000 Syrians have fled to neighboring countries. And with this, we end our news bulletin from Orient TV. For more updates about the Syrian revolution, visit our Facebook page. Thank you for watching, and good night.